I'm Katherine. I'm a PhD student in bioethics and health policy at Hopkins University. I'm affiliated with both the Bioethics Institute and the Center for Psychedelic Research there. And I feel like I was set up really well by previous talks. I'm going to be talking today about a measure that we're considering for the clinical trials at Hopkins in order to mitigate bias. And so I'll be talking about this method of introducing independent actors in research, to the question that was asked earlier, and what exactly we're gaining or losing by doing so. This idea is still fairly new. It's very much in the planning phase as well, so we welcome any thoughts that you would have. No conflicts of interest disclosed, and I have no funding acknowledgements either. So, as Isla very nicely set this up, this idea of independent actors and what exactly we stand to gain or lose came about partly because of the recent media coverage in the States and elsewhere on the potential for non-financial conflicts of interest in psychedelic research. And so these critiques kind of largely center around the claim that personal experience, psychedelic experience by researchers may be biasing scientific judgment and conduct, partly by fostering undue enthusiasm about psychedelics, and that may be influencing objectivity. There have also been allegations about blurred lines between advocacy and research in psychedelic, I think partly stemming a lot from the MAPS advisory committee meeting as well. So these quotes, I think, are fairly illustrative. So the New York Times article about how psychedelic research got high on its own supply, and so they write about, these articles write about this true believer mentality that they think exists in psychedelic research. There's this accusation that the field draws eccentric types that, instead of conducting research with clinical interest, they want psychedelics to be accepted by society. There have been allegations that study staff or investigators or participants as well are true believers in the potential for psychedelics as well, and that this is skewing outcome data and reflecting adverse events. And this concern was raised in the FDA advisory committee meeting for MDMA, where they wrote about investigators holding very strong prior positive beliefs about psychedelics, and there were worries that this was skewing the adverse event data. And so in response to these allegations and concerns about bias, which I want to note, it's been very hard to determine the actual scope and extent and the impact of these bias accusations. It's been very hard to tell what effect this is actually having on the data. But I think even if we can't determine the extent, the perceived presence of this bias is still having impact on public trust on these results. And given that this data is what's being used for FDA decisions, I think it's still worth addressing, even if we can't determine the actual extent of the bias. And so a number of articles and proposals have been made in the literature about what we can do about this. So many psychedelic clinical trials aim for randomized control design in order to minimize bias and to aim for random participant allocation between arms, but it's insufficient to prevent all forms of bias. And so these proposals are kind of additional measures that have been suggested. So these things, also from Hill's paper, having an independent assessment for adverse events. McNamee and colleagues propose having prior scholarship be independently reviewed, having the video recordings of the participant sessions be independently reviewed by a third party. Aaron Kesselheim and Daniel Eichencraft-Klein proposed this idea of a money blind for psychedelic clinical trials, which is where the pharmaceutical company would put up the money for the trial, but a third party like the NIH or some other health ministry would pick the investigator to run a design study, so effectively introducing some form of independence. The last one is from Caius and colleagues, and also speaks to this point about how we should ensure scientific teams should contain individuals who have not used psychedelics. And these individuals should have a prominent role with regard to data analysis and integrity. And so all of these proposals kind of have in common is that we refer to this idea of independence. They introduce an independent actor in some form in the research. But I want to note that this is also not new to research itself. IRBs are essentially a form of independent review already. So are data safety monitoring boards for clinical trials. You can even think of peer review as a form of independent review. So this concept of introducing someone who's somewhat independent is not new. But what all of these proposals have in common is that they're really aiming for bias mitigation. This is also not unique to psychedelic research. So there was a pretty prominent review published recently, CAST review, which was a scientific evidence review on for gender affirming care commissioned by the National Health Service in England. And so the authors of that review explicitly chose it to be independent of both NHS gender services and providers of gender dysphoria services. And the NIH in the US also has this replication to enhance research impact initiative, which is essentially a funding mechanism for researchers to apply to get funding for a contract research organization, which is a company that will perform clinical trials for profit for pharmaceutical companies or whoever pays them. And so the NIH has this initiative where they'll pair you with a contract research site in order to replicate the results. So in this presentation, I want to focus on these kind of proposals. We call them independence-enhancing procedures that really tease out what we might be gaining or losing from using them in psychedelic research. So to give a rough tentative definition of the kinds of things we're talking about, these are the proposals that introduce independent actors to try to be other researchers from outside psychedelic science or contract research sites within the research process. And some of the proposals too, they ask us to substitute researchers who have risk of bias with other actors. So the money plan idea substitutes a pharmaceutical industry chosen investigator with an independent one. And as I mentioned, this is not new. Having independent statisticians review data is essentially the same thing, so are RCTs, DSMBs, and elsewhere. But I think when we were thinking about implementing this kind of proposal for the clinical trials, we found that proposals across the literature often do not specify what kind of independence that we should be looking for. And there are so many ways that a person can be independent, and the desired sense is often unspecified. So you might think a researcher can be independent from certain funding sources. For example, they don't accept funding from the pharmaceutical industry. They can be independent from universities or from certain scientific communities. They can be independent from the state or from certain civil society actors. And so this is kind of often just left unspoken. And so I won't go into the full argument here, but so we argue that independence-enhancing procedures aim to reduce bias by introducing independent actors who hold values, functions, preferences, and interests that don't bias them away from objectivity. And so we're looking for independence in the sense of being free from any influence that might alter their choices in a way that reduces objectivity and should be free from influence from the original researcher. And I'll note that this working definition here is also very aspirational. I don't think any researcher is likely to ever meet this definition, where all humans and all researchers hold values and interests. And so this is still very aspirational, but I think you can also note that bias comes in degrees, and less bias can be better than more bias. So the maybe still a good thing to strive for. So practically, when we're thinking about what kind of independent actor to select, this might look like selecting someone external from the research team, having a different funding source in order to address financial interests, being from a different academic field or having a different goal or mission, being from a different organizational unit or institution, and more procedurally, building structuring communication between the researcher and the independent actor to prevent undue influence might be important. And so obviously the biggest benefit here would be the potential for bias mitigation, we think. So by substituting the researcher with an independent actor, you're kind of addressing the potential for unconscious or conscious biases that might exist. And so turning to the example of psychedelic science, if you had concerns about investigators being true believers in the potential psychedelics, and that's just skewing the collection of outcome data. One thing we've been thinking about is having an independent site run part of the trial, or having an independent organization collect the data. And so this would kind of address the influence of the investigator's biases on data collection. Similarly, having an independent actor offers an additional stage for quality control beyond peer review and independent replication of results. So if you incorporate an independent actor during the research process, you're really offering this additional opportunity where standards can be checked and you can ensure there are data errors, so this is kind of an additional benefit. This next benefit depends partly on how the independent review is implemented, but if you end up publishing the methods as a result of the independent review and how the independent actors are working, this would lead to enhanced transparency about the research as well. and if you made this open to the scientific community or to the public. This next one is also a bit of an open empirical question, so it's not very certain, but there might be potential for improved public trust in research results from using independent actors as well. So there was a recent Pew Research Center survey in 2019, which found that participants would trust research results more if they were reviewed by an independent committee. So I don't think this says very much. The survey question was pretty simple. It doesn't tell you anything about what they think about peer review by itself or whether they think peer review needs to be paired with independent review by a committee, but I think it points to the potential for independent review as a method to improve trust. And there's some qualitative work as well on how people perceive experts, and one study found that their trustworthiness of experts was affected by their perceived independence from non-experts, from the political elites. Finally, independent actors just might be valuable because they include different perspectives in the research, and so including independent actors in different fields or institutions might force researchers to really clarify and make explicit any assumptions they might have had about the research or any underlying beliefs. So for example, if we're writing a protocol for an independent actor to follow where they reflect on adverse events, it might really force the researcher to think like, what have I assumed here, and what do I need to make explicit for someone who's not in this field. And it might lead to a more thorough understanding of the problem, potentially to having people from outside the field look at it. But I think there are pretty significant downsides to bringing in independent actors as well, even though it seems like a promising solution. And the biggest one, we think, is this potential for independent actors to not have adequate expertise. So this would be in cases where you think the actors don't have the knowledge or the experience to really run certain aspects of the trial properly, like experimentation or data analysis or participant care. And this is kind of the biggest objection we get to when we bring this up to other researchers. But this risk may be inherent to the use of independent actors just because of how scientific expertise is gained. Researchers gain expertise by spending a long amount of time in the field, during which they develop connections to other people, they really establish their views on a topic, they internalize particular assumptions about the field, and so this process of gaining scientific expertise, I think, means there's inherently a trade-off between introducing an independent actor and expertise, and so it's just something to take into consideration. Depending on who the independent actor is, I think there's also potential for them to just have different or misaligned incentives. So here I'm really thinking about cases like contract research sites. So researchers really usually are incentivized to complete their study for a variety of reasons, and one such as they want to gather enough high-quality knowledge to answer their research question. But contract research sites might potentially be more incentivized to finish the study by a certain timeline or to complete recruitment according to the deadline they've been given, which might potentially then compromise research quality, but I think this is also an open empirical question. This next one is a bit fuzzy too, but also something we hear a lot from other researchers, is that independent actors might just care less about the research. Researchers usually either care about the population they study or the topic that they have, or their lab animals or the participants, and so this care might then translate into being particularly attentive to participant well-being or being very ridiculous about your data collection. But independent actors who are selected precisely because of their detachment from the topic at hand might lack this feeling of care. And while I don't think that this necessarily leads to poor quality research, I think you could probably still carry out pretty rigorous and high quality research even if you don't care about it. I think there is the potential. I think another big group of risks here is that your independent actor might just introduce different biases from the ones you were originally trying to mitigate. So if you financially compensate the independent actor for your work, you're also already introducing a financial concept of interest potentially. And so when trying or not whether or not to decide to introduce an independent actor or not, you might have to weigh the risks that come from the original biases you're trying to mitigate and the ones that might potentially be introduced. And obviously, a large group of concerns is this increased burden that you put on research stakeholders, and so this kind of proposal is obviously extremely expensive. Even running disproportionate in the clinical trial at an external site or an independent site would almost double research costs. And these costs are often borne by the public, especially where most of the funding comes from the states, and so I think there's conversations to be had about responsible allocation of resources and whether this is something we really want to be spending a significant amount of money on. It can also lead to studies taking more time, which could then delay publication of results and development of effective interventions. There's also a risk of overregulation if this kind of thing became mandated as part of the research process. That would likely to result in more spending on compliance, as well as just more time spent by researchers on compliance activities as well. So the last one is a bit fuzzy, but it's whether if this sort of proposal were mandated as well, whether this might shift research norms. And so right now, researchers are kind of largely trusted to conduct ethical and rigorous research. There are checks, but usually no one's looking over your shoulder at every stage of the research process to ensure that you're doing things ethically and that all standards are being met. And so one worry is that by introducing independent actors, we're kind of losing or diminishing this norm of self-regulation of research. I think it's open whether this is a good or bad thing. I think different people might disagree, but it still has the potential if this thing became more widespread. I'll just sum it up here. And I want to emphasize that I'm not advocating in this presentation for the use of these actors or not. I think I'm still pretty undecided as to whether I think they're a good thing, but more independence might not always equal better or rigorous research, and that these benefits and risks are probably pretty context dependent. So for fields that are pretty niche or highly specialized, I think your trade-off between independence and expertise is going to be huge. So for fields like psychedelic science, which are pretty controversial, or for trials where the results are particularly important, I'm thinking of examples like vaccine trials, independent actors might be worth using, but I think they'll be fairly trial dependent as well as field dependent. So with that, thank you, and thank you to David Hayden, Edward Jacobs, Rebecca Aaron, and Brian Kirk for the work on this project.
Excellent, thank you, Katherine. And yeah, we have the first question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I apologize on behalf of the crew about the technical stuff. Really interesting stuff, and I feel like this is like a really heavy way of checking the integrity of the research process. Not just in psychedelic research, but in any kind of research. I was in bilingual research for brain training, like training cognitive functions. There were like obvious biases in that field as well, because people want to believe in the ability to train cognition and so on. So I think this is a really welcome approach, kind of like heavy in the way that you present. I'm thinking more in the context of like open science, of not necessarily having any imposed structures of surveillance or like this, but instead just like open communication between research fields, because now the problem is that the researchers are within their own silo and like just amplifying each other's opinions and approaches. So we would need more like this interdisciplinary communication and reality checking. Just comment. Yeah,
yeah, thank you. I agree it's a pretty extreme measure to take. This was partly motivated by concerns that the accusations of bias were kind of changing all of clinical trial results. There's a thought that there's a problem with one trial, therefore the public thinks that all of the results from psychedelic clinical trials can't be trusted. And so this is pretty extreme, but it's one thing that we're thinking that might improve public trust in the results. Since weaker things like open science, I think, are not persuading people.
Coming back to the previous talk, do you think these independent actors should be psychedelically naive?
I think if your original concern was that personal psychedelic experience was biasing researchers in some way, and while that's very hard to empirically show, it's something I've been thinking about for a while, then you would probably want the independent actor to be separate from the psychedelic field, if that was the concern you were trying to address.
Thank you for the talk. I think it's a very interesting and important discussion. I do, however, have some serious doubts about whether the public trust problem would be alleviated by it. So I have really a lot of experience being on research funding panels in the econometry, in the ERC, and other panels. And if you've been on a lot of these panels where you often judge things you don't know much about, which helps people then get funding under certain circumstances that nobody on the panel knows much about it. So there are very interesting processes happening in these contexts, which make me very reluctant to think that the public trust in the outcome will be improved. So if it's about public trust, I mean, you have a peculiar problem in the US at the moment with public trust in science that's maybe more exacerbated than in some other countries. But I'm not sure that these practices of peer review and bringing in people who don't know much about it, or who might even have an opposite agenda that they don't make explicit, etc., is really going to help that. So it seems to me that you're asking two different questions. One is about public trust, and one is about better science and just biases in the science. And I think it would be worth disentangling that.
I agree. Come to the economics of the public trust aspect. It's pretty unique because not go out a very good study for these processes, and it's pretty unknown about whether it would actually help, but it's just something I was thinking about.
Great, still more time for this one or two questions, if there are any. I think there are no more questions, so thanks again, Katherine, for the talk.